This talk will be about a very specific cryptographic tool which is used in blockchains, which are signatures and more specifically multi-signatures. So when I was invited to give this talk, my first intent was to give a broad overview of where cryptography is used in blockchains, and it turns out that 20 or even 30 minutes is too short for this, but I would like to start this talk by still giving you a kind of very broad survey of what cryptography is used for in blockchains. So you all know a blockchain is a ledger where people can include transactions. So the very first thing that you need is to define valid transactions, right? Which transactions are allowed to go into the ledger and which are not. And for this, what is used is digital signatures, which means that a transaction to be valid must, it's one of the requirements, but must come with typically a valid digital signature with respect to some public key which controls, for example, some bitcoins, right? And it turns out that signatures are a bit too limited for blockchains, and if you really want to do things efficiently, you need more advanced kind of signatures, which are multi-signatures, threshold signatures, aggregate signatures, and this will be the topic of this talk. But that's not the only thing you need to build a blockchain. So a blockchain is also a ledger which is maintained in a distributed and decentralized way. And so you need to achieve distributed consensus on the state of the ledger. And basically the way all blockchains and all cryptocurrencies work is that you have nodes which broadcast the transactions they want to include in the next block. And you have some kind of random lottery which will elect a kind of dictator node which will impose the set of transactions which will be included in the next block and appended to the ledger. And so the main challenge is how do we implement this distributed lottery, right? And so in Bitcoin, for example, it's achieved with what is called proof of work, which I think you all know how it works basically. So for this, the nodes must solve a cryptographic puzzle, which is implemented with hash functions in Bitcoin, and essentially each node will have a probability to solve the puzzle, which will be proportional to his computing power. Okay. But this is not the only way to implement this kind of random lottery. Another way is proof of stake, where the probability to be elected at the node which will impose the next block is proportional to the number of coins you possess. Okay, and for this you need other tools such as verifiable random functions, which are kind of pseudo-random functions, but for which you can prove that it has been correctly computed. Okay, and this is used, for example, in Cardano or in Algorand to run this random lottery. And recently there have been some new tools which have been proposed, like verifiable delay functions, which are functions which require a lot of sequential work to compute, but for which you can prove that it has been computed efficiently. And again, this allows to implement some kind of random lottery to elect the leader. And you have all other kind of proofs, like, for example, proof of space and these kind of things. Okay. So this is to achieve the distributed consensus, for which we need this kind of tools. And the last thing for which you need cryptography is to provide privacy. As you probably know, Bitcoin does not provide a lot of privacy. It's only pseudonymous, which means that you don't know who hides behind a given public key. But actually, you can, since all transactions are public and are in the blockchain, you can do a lot of analysis. You can cluster the addresses, and if you're clever, you can even identify who's behind an address. So people have started to think of how to improve the privacy provided by blockchains. And for example, you have tools like ring signatures, which are kind of like signatures, but with an anonymity feature, which means that you can pick any public keys you like in the blockchain and prove that you possess at least one secret key among these public keys, which means that you can spend one coin among kind of anonymity set of coins, but nobody can know for sure which coin was spent. And more precisely, you need traceable weak signatures to prevent double spending. And this is, for example, implemented in Monero, which also implements something called stealth addresses, which is a kind of way to encrypt the address to which you send the coin. So it protects the spender and the receiver of a transaction, right? You could also try to hide the value in a transaction, right? The number of bitcoins, for example, that you are transferring in a transaction. And this is called confidential transactions. And for this, you need tools which are called homomorphic commitments. So it's kind of, it's a bit like a public key encryption scheme, but for which you can prove that the transaction is well balanced, that it doesn't create money, okay? And you also need some tools which are called range proofs. And finally, if you want to really do something very advanced and which protects all sensitive information in your blockchain, you would need something called zero knowledge proofs and some specific types of zero knowledge proofs, which are called zero knowledge snarks, which are some non-interactive zero knowledge proofs. And this is, for example, implemented in Zcash. So this is just a slide to prove that cryptography is really important in blockchains. And if you have any question about the tools I will not talk about in this talk, feel free to come and talk to me during breaks. So in this talk, I will focus on signatures, okay, which is how we prove that the transaction is valid. So my running example here will be Bitcoin, but most of what I will say here applies to any blockchain. So how does a Bitcoin transaction work? But in Bitcoin, you don't have accounts. You only have transactions which spends inputs and create outputs. And so an input will consist of a reference to an output of a previous transaction, okay, and a signature authorizing the spending of this output. And it will create new outputs, which will consist of an amount of Bitcoin, and a public key which will control the spending of this new output. Okay, and if you want to spend the output, for example, this output in the transaction, you need to provide a signature which is valid under this public key. Okay, so that's the way you control the spending of bitcoins in the Bitcoin blockchain by providing a signature which is valid for some public key. Okay. And it turns out that signatures in Bitcoin are really important. So in Bitcoin and virtually all blockchains, the signature algorithm which is used is called ECDSA. I will say a bit more about elliptic curve cryptography and ECDSA later. And it turns out that the size of an ECDSA public key is 33 bytes, and the typical size of an ECDSA signature is 72 bytes. And so I did a quick computation. It's not exact, but if you look at the number of transactions in the blockchain, if you consider that there are roughly 2 inputs per transaction, it means that the Bitcoin blockchain contains, I think it's very conservative, it might be even more, but at least 88 gigabytes of just public keys and signatures, which is roughly 40% of the size of the blockchain. Okay, and I think it's an understatement. So as you see, it's really a huge part of the blockchain size, which means that signatures and public keys take a lot of space in the blocks, which means also that anybody who wants to set up a new full node will have to download the entire blockchain and check these 500 million signatures. Actually, it's the main bottleneck when you want to start a new full node, a new Bitcoin full node. Okay, so this is just to prove you that it's really important to optimize signatures as much as possible. If you can save 2 bytes in your signature size, you should do it, because it will, given the number of signatures which will end up in the blockchain, it's really important. Okay, and it has other impacts, like for example in Bitcoin the size of the blocks is limited. So basically people are competing to get their transactions included in the block. And when too many people start using Bitcoin, they are competing by paying higher fees. And when the blocks become really full, the fees can be very high. Like at the end of 2017, you could pay like $100 to get the transaction included in the blockchain. So if we can save in the size of the signatures and the size of the public keys and so on, this means that we will be able to put more transactions in a block, and this will reduce this kind of competition to get transactions included in the blockchain. So I'll just give a few formal definitions about what a signature scheme is. So basically a signature scheme, it's 3 algorithms. So a key generation algorithm, which will generate a public key and a secret key. Okay. So anyone who wants to create a Bitcoin address will run this key generation algorithm and will make the public key public, and will keep the secret key secret to spend the Bitcoin later. And it has a signature algorithm which takes a secret key and a message and which returns a signature, and a verification algorithm which takes a public key, a message, and a signature and just says whether the signature is valid or not. Okay, so it's quite simple, right? And the security notion we want for signature schemes is called existential unfungibility against Trojan message attacks. So we define security by a security experiment where we have an adversary which knows the public key, for example, of Alice, PKA, and which can the adversary can ask signatures to Alice on messages of its choice, right? So it will have access to what we call an oracle, where it can submit messages and get signatures back. Okay, and at some point it will try to produce a new signature for a message that Alice has never signed, and if it succeeds, when if this signature is valid for the public key of Alice, we say that the adversary has broken the scheme, and it's successful, right? So a signature scheme will be said to be secure under this security notion if no efficient adversary can win this security experiment with a good probability, right? So this is our signature is defined, but quite often transactions in Bitcoin or other blockchains must be authorized by multiple parties. Okay, so for example, you could imagine a shared wallet, or when you want to do escrow, you will use this kind of mechanism. And it's also very important for what are called payment channels, which are used, for example, in the Lightning Network. So the first thing you do when you want to open a payment channel is that Alice and Bob will send Bitcoins to an address which is controlled by 2 public keys, one which is controlled by Alice and one by Bob. Okay. For example, it's also useful for atomic swaps and all these kind of things. Okay, so it's really a common situation where we need to create Bitcoins which are controlled by multiple parties. Okay, and currently in Bitcoin, the solution which is implemented is the trivial solution, which is we'll just instead of having one single public key which is controlling the Bitcoin, we will have a concatenation of multiple public keys, and when we want to spend these Bitcoins, we'll just provide one signature for each of these public keys. Okay, so say if we have like 5 parties controlling the Bitcoin, and these 5 parties must agree to spend the Bitcoin, then we'll have 5 public keys controlling the output, and when they spend, they will provide 5 signatures. Okay, and actually, all these signatures are signing the same message. So we could try to come with something more efficient. For example, we could try to come with some kind of interactive scheme between the signers, which will allow them to provide only one signature. Okay, which will prove that everyone has agreed to sign with their public keys. And even better, we could try to find a scheme which allows to combine all the public keys of the 5 signers into one single public key. We call this an aggregate key. Okay, and if we do this, well, we have something which is n times more efficient if we have n signers, because we'll only have one public key which is recorded in the blockchain, and when we want to spend, we'll have only one signature which proves that all the signers have agreed to spend the bitcoins. Okay. And actually, the main difficulty to come with such schemes is what is called rogue key attacks. The problem is in Bitcoin is that there is no certification authority which validates public keys, right? Anybody can choose any public key it wants and say, okay, this is my public key for the scheme. And actually, it could be that, for example, if we have 2 signers, Alice and Bob, and Alice says, okay, this is my public key. Bob could try to choose his public key as a function of the public key of Alice in a way that will allow Bob to sign on his own. And we will see an example just after. So now we'll get a bit in the mathematical details of how this is achieved. So modern cryptography uses what are called elliptic curves to implement signature schemes. So elliptic curves are defined by this type of equations. If you represent them over the reals, they look like this, except in cryptography we work over finite fields. So basically an elliptic curve is a set of pairs of finite field elements which satisfy an equation of this type. And it turns out that you can add points on the curve in a way that defines a group in the mathematical sense. And which means that you can define a generator of this group, and for any integer n, you can compute n times this generator, and you can do this quite efficiently in time log n using an algorithm which is called double and add. And the nice thing is that this is a one-way function in a way, which means that if I give you a group element and I ask you to find the integer n, which is such that h is equal to n times g, for elliptic curves of sufficiently large size, this is intractable. Okay, and this is called the discrete logarithm problem. Okay, and for elliptic curves of size, let's say 2 to the 2 and 56, we can compute n times g efficiently, but we cannot compute n if I give you h in an efficient way. Okay. Signatures based on the discrete logarithm have a long history, and so the two main schemes in this area are called ECDSA, which is an elliptic curve variant of an algorithm which is called DSA, and which has been standardized by NIST. But it turns out that another scheme had been proposed in 1989 by someone called Schnorr. Unfortunately, Schnorr had patented this scheme at the time. And so this ECDSA scheme was standardized in order to escape the Schnorr patent. And it's a bit unfortunate because ECDSA has Schnorr signatures have a lot of features that ECDSA don't have. In particular, Schnorr signatures, if you look at the signature equation, it's linear. And this is the main feature which will enable multi-signatures and these kind of things. So when Bitcoin launched in 2009, it was using ECDSA mainly because at the time it was the most efficient and standardized and well-deployed scheme we had. Schnorr patents expired only in 2008. And since then, people are switching or trying to switch to Schnorr signatures because they will allow the kind of applications like multi-signature that I mentioned. So to be clear, you can do multi-signatures with ECDSA, but it's much less efficient than with Schnorr. Okay, so Schnorr signatures and ECDSA signatures are basically as efficient, but if you want more advanced features, you need Schnorr. So how do Schnorr signatures work? A secret key will just be an integer in modulo the order of the group you are considering, and the public key will just be x times g, where g is the generator of your group. Okay, and since we are using an elliptic curve such that the discrete logarithm is hard, you cannot retrieve the secret key from the public key. Okay, which is what we want, right? And to compute a Schnorr signature, we will first generate what we call an ephemeral public key, an ephemeral key pair by drawing a random integer r and computing big R, which will be R times G. And then you will compute R plus H. So here H is a hash function. So you're hashing the public key, the ephemeral public key, and the message, and you multiply this by X. And your signature is just the pair RS. And to verify that a signature is valid, you check that S times G is equal to R plus the H of X, R, and M times X. And actually, these two equations, so the signature equation and the verification equation, are really the same equation, but this one is over the integers, and this one is over the group elements. So to go from the signature equation to the verification equation, you just multiply this by G, the generator of the group. Okay. And okay, this scheme is you can prove that this scheme is secure under the discrete logarithm assumption. So now, how could you try to get a multi-signature scheme for Schnorr signatures? Well, since the computation of the signature is linear, what you could do is, if Alice has a public key XA and Bob has a public key XB, you could compute the sum of these two public keys, and this would be your aggregate public key. Okay. And then Alice and Bob could generate this ephemeral public key in a joint way by generating each one their own ephemeral public key and adding them, and then computing the sum of these two ephemeral public keys, and then computing exactly as in simple Schnorr signatures. Okay, two Schnorr signatures, and then add them. Okay, and if you do this, you can check that the signature RS that you obtain will be a correct Schnorr signature for the public key X, for the aggregate key X, and for the message M. Okay, so this seems nice, but unfortunately, you have rogue key attacks against this scheme. If Alice announces her public key first, then Bob can set its own public key in a weird way, which would be X times G minus the public key of Alice. And this way, it's easy to see that the aggregate public key will be exactly X times G, which means that it's a standard short signature, except that Bob knows the secret key for this public key, right? Which means that now Bob can compute a signature on his own without Alice, okay? And that's exactly the difficulties that I mentioned before, okay? We are in a distributed setting where nobody checks how you choose your public key. So here Bob can do this attack, which means that if Alice and Bob agree to have bitcoins locked in and controlled by the public key X, and if Bob does this attack, then he can spend the bitcoin without Alice on his own. Okay. So in order to thwart the attack, you have to modify a bit the way the signature is computed. I won't go into the details, but I will just mention that there is a scheme which is called MUSIG, and which exactly gives you a Schnorr multi-signature, which is provably secure even against rogue key attacks. Okay, and I will skip the details because I'm running a bit out of time. And let me just mention that this scheme would allow to replace the current mechanism in Bitcoin, which basically is the concatenation of public keys and signatures, by a more efficient scheme, which allows to have only one public key and one signature. And actually, you could even extend this to transactions with multiple inputs, which means that currently in Bitcoin, you need to provide one signature for each input, but you could, using this kind of scheme, have only one signature for all inputs in the transaction. Okay, and actually you can do even better than that if you use what are called aggregate signatures, which are a bit like multi-signatures except for different messages. Then, so it's not really possible with Schnorr signatures. For this, you need a more advanced tool, which is called a pairing, which only exists for specific elliptic curves. But if you do this, you have schemes. In particular, the most prominent one is called BLS, which will allow you to take any number of signatures on different messages and to aggregate them into a single signature. Okay, and you can do this publicly even after the signers have produced their signature, which means that this aggregation could be done by miners, for example, which take all the transaction and would aggregate all the signatures in all the transactions into one single signature, which means that using this kind of scheme, you could have only one signature for all the transaction into your blockchain. Okay, which would be a huge space improvement in terms of storage in the blockchain. Okay, so verification will still be costly, but at least from a storage point of view, it would be a huge improvement. Okay, so this ends my talk. I just wanted to give you the main ideas about how we can make things more efficient and with respect to digital signatures in blockchain. I'm happy to take questions if you have.
I've been reading about these people who invented, what do they call it, adapter signatures.
Yeah, adapter signatures, yeah. It has been proposed by Andrew Polstra, I guess. So yeah, it's also based on Schnorr signatures. And it allows a kind of, to implement a smart contract, but only using standard Schnorr signatures. So it's a really nice idea. He came with this because of a new proposal which is called Mimblewimble, for which you cannot have this Bitcoin script. So if you want to implement smart contracts, you need to come with clever ideas like this. And adapter signatures are a way to, so how it works is that Alice would produce an adapter signature, and Bob could check that this adapter signature is such that when Alice will produce the real signature, Bob will learn a secret. And this way you can have the kind of, you can see this like a clever replacement to hash time lock contracts, hash time lock contracts. And it's based on the linearity of equations of short signatures as well. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned sometimes in the beginning of the talk that you use an oracle. So I wanted to know, how does this use for, what does it mean in practice? Is it,
you mean when I define the security here? Yeah. That the attacker has access to an oracle? Yeah. So it's a very strong assumption. It's not a given that the adversary will have access to such an oracle. And in many situations, actually, the adversary will not get to choose the messages that Alice will sign. But there are situations, for example, if you could imagine that this key pair is used to authenticate Alice. And how would you authenticate Alice? The person who wants to authenticate Alice would send a challenge, and Alice will produce a signature on this challenge. And if you do this, Alice is exactly behaving as an oracle, because anybody can say, okay, I want you to authenticate to me, so please sign this challenge, and I will send Alice a message, and she will send back the signature. So it's a very specific use case, but it could happen. And the philosophy behind designing signature schemes is that you don't know how people will use this signature scheme. So in many situations, the attacker will not have access to such an oracle, but it could be. So we will try to make the signatures secure in the worst case, let's say. Okay, and basically this security notion is kind of the worst case for Alice and the best case for the attacker.
So I think we should thank